Welcome everyone to Color Commentary. We are your Pauper commentators, Michael Petchik and Adrian Guarzales. How's it going, Adrian?
Pretty good, Mike. Pretty good. So good, in fact, that we have a Patreon. For just $1 an episode, you can hear the full show, including our pre and post shows where we sometimes talk about Magic. Most of the time we don't, and you get access to our little community and our patron-exclusive Discord channel.
Just really jumping into it this week.
I'm raring to go. I'm ready.
We've got a pretty big discussion to get through today, so I appreciate the fervor you're showing here. We are also brought to you in part by Hipsters of the Coast. They are a Magic content hub for all different types of Magic content. They've got articles, they've got podcasts. Go check them out. Show them some love on social media. All that good jazz.
Mike, it's just that normally I ask you how you're doing, and then you say you got anything from me this week, and it's the same thing every week. So I thought you would appreciate me cutting out some of the.
You're breaking the paradigm here. You're disrupting a market.
Dude, consider this podcast reption. I'm blowing it all up, and then I'm going to rebuild it in order to deliver a multi-platform, authentic experience marketed specifically for millennials.
God, that as someone who works in a startup, that was chillingly good. All right, so Adrian, what are we talking about this week?
We are redoing our Pauper Primer deck series. We haven't done it since I think the first year of the show.
Maybe the second.
I think it's been quite a while, and the format's changed so much with the bannings that we thought it might be time to go ahead and revisit some of these archetypes, starting with this episode and maybe definitely continuing the others. Unsure how long it will be.
I mean, we literally sat down to record tonight and realized that there were 2 more decks we had to add to this episode alone, so might be a few episodes here. All right, so we sort of sat down, we sorted these into the super archetypes, and tonight on our plate we have Aggro and Tempo decks, and in the future weeks we will be covering the rest of the quote-unquote super archetypes, and we're going to try and give you sort of some analogous decks for these decks, so if you've played other formats, what you could sort of compare these decks to, how these decks are hoping to win, some of the key cards and synergies and strategies for them, and where this deck really excels, like what matchups are really solid for it, where does it do well, where does it do poorly. And the goal of this is sort of to be an introduction for people who are perhaps looking into the format, don't really know where to start, and we're hoping to provide you a nice, couple of hour primer on the format. All right, so Adrian, what is the first deck we have on our list for tonight?
The first deck we have on our list is Stompy, mono green Stompy specifically, because I think that's the only. Well, there are other decks that you could consider Stompy decks in our format, but that's the one that people mean when they say Stompy. They mean the green deck.
Yeah, and this is a very sort of tried and true, tested deck archetype. Although, as we were talking about it, outside of like recent standard where it showed up for a little bit, it's been a little absent for a while.
Yeah, Mike means as an archetype in other formats. In Legacy, for example, the archetype is really a bunch of different ones, but at their core, they're disruptive aggro decks. So by disruptive, I don't mean like Force of Will and stuff, but I mean that they play fast mana and Chalice of the Void, and they try and lock their opponents out of the game and then beat them to death with threats. So Eldrazi, Dragon Stompy if you're old school, Moon Stompy a little bit more modern flavor, are all seeking to do that. So Stompy and Pauper, however, does not have access to those taxing or prison elements, and so it's really more of like an aggro deck, like a green burn deck almost, where you're looking to turn your creatures into kind of burn spells. Would you agree?
Yeah, so this is a deck that gets to play a lot of low cost, good power to mana cost cards. You're looking at stuff like your Nettle Sentinels, you're looking at little known draft chaff, Skargan Pit Skulk, and a lot of these just very sort of low to the ground, efficient green creatures, and then a smattering of ways to make them better, basically. So over the years, we've seen a variety of pump spells show up in this deck, and it is reasonably customizable within there. But the main one that is just never going to leave is Rancor.
Right. Rancor, I think, is what makes that deck playable. Certainly the fact that it plays a lot of 1-mana 2/2s. You have Nettle Sentinel, you have ostensibly Skargan Pit Skulk, but Rancor is what gets the beats through. It gives you both evasion and a power bonus, so that you can punch through enemy defenses and hit connect, and also has this huge upside of never truly going away unless your opponent kills your creature while it's on the stack. So it's very recursive.
Yeah, you've got to be very particular about how you deal with this. Other notables in the deck include Burning Tree Emissary, a almost quote unquote free 2/2. We have Vault Scourge, which has waffled in and out of the deck, but I personally really love it as a colorless, evasive lifelinker. And then the actual consistency of what the pump spells have been has changed over the years. We've kind of seen a move away from, I'm going to completely blank on the name of it, the landfall one.
Groundswell.
Groundswell, thank you. But the ones that sort of stuck around and sort of stood the test of time are Hunger of the Howl Pack, which is an instant for 1 green. It puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature, but if a creature's died this turn, you put 3 +1/+1 counters on that creature instead.
Yeah, and so this is what I mean by kind of a green burn deck. You're looking to leverage the creatures and the pump spells to kill your opponent as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Yep, and the other really sort of evergreen one is Vines of Vastwood, which is the green mana for an instant. Target creature can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control this turn. And then it has kicker of a green, and if you pay that extra green, that creature also gets +4/+4 until end of turn. And more recent versions of this deck have also been spotted running things like Moldervine Cloak, which is a very bad equivalent of Rancor, but you can only play 4 copies of Rancor, and sometimes you need more copies of this sort of resilient, lasting pump effect. And the other thing that I think we should probably touch on here is Kyrian Ranger. Do you kind of want to explain the synergy here with this in this particular shell?
Sure. So Kyrian Ranger allows you to play a very low land count. Kyrian Ranger is an elf that lets you return a forest to your hand each turn, so even on your opponent's turns you could do that. So it lets you cheat a lot on mana by being able to basically rebuy lands and not having to worry so much about playing them. And I think that Stompy actually plays a very low land count, like 16 or something like that. Like it's very, very, very low. The other thing I want to point out about Stompy that you sort of mentioned earlier in its customization is it does have access to some very powerful sideboard cards. Gleeful Sabotage comes to mind.
You get stuff like Scattershot Archer.
Yeah, gut shot, if you consider that a green sideboard card, I guess. But it does have access to, even though it's only in one color, green does have access to a lot of different tools. You have destroy enchantment type spells, you have destroy artifact type spells, you have fight spells and pump spells. So it's not bad. Yeah.
So where does this deck sort of really succeed, and where does it line up poorly?
I think it succeeded a lot back when Mono Blue was one of the top decks, because Mono Blue doesn't really have a lot of ways to effectively fight that many creatures. It started seeing a huge downturn when Boros Monarch became a thing, because it just can outgrind that deck. All of its creatures block it effectively, basically. It has all the removal it needs, and then it'll grind it out in the long game with card advantage. So I think that and also Prismatic Strands. So I think that's kind of where that deck started to fall off quite a bit, was when the Boros deck started becoming really popular.
That said, we have been seeing a recent resurgence of this. So if you're a big fan of turning green creatures sideways and sort of more involved combat steps, I'd say this is definitely one to check out. There's a decent amount of play with it, and I don't know, I've enjoyed this deck in the past. All right, what do we have up next on our list of aggro decks here?
Burn. So sometimes we call this a combo deck, but as I was telling Mike earlier, there are a lot of people out there who want to shoehorn a deck into one archetype or another, and that's like a people thing, right? Like people just want things to fit nicely in the little boxes, and we grow, we change. I've learned that is really not the case for people, and so I don't think it's really the case for Magic decks. So today, Burn is an aggro deck according to us.
Yeah, and this is very similar to Burn decks in pretty much any other Eternal format, with one notable exception. We don't have great creatures for this deck. There's a couple of them.
Yeah, so in Modern, of course, let's take Legacy, and because in Legacy there actually is a mono red Burn deck. In Modern, I think they're mostly 3-colored. But yeah, you have access to all the powerful burn spells, but none of the creatures, like Mike said, we don't get Monastery, Swift Spear, Eidolon, or the Great Revel, or anything like that.
Yeah. So in terms of what this deck is trying to do is, very simply put, it's trying to count to 20 faster than your opponent can. That's all it's doing. It is not a complicated game plan, but it certainly can be an efficient one. So it's running basically every version of Lightning Bolt it can that is 1 mana, deal 3 damage to your opponent, and then it's running the slightly worse ones and the slightly worse ones, and so on and so forth. But it does have some interesting sort of synergies within it. So we have, for example, Curse of the Pierced Heart, which most folks probably don't remember. It's just 1 red for an enchantment or a curse enchant a player during the beginning of enchanted player's upkeep. It deals 1 damage to that player.
That's how we did it before, Thermo Alchemist.
Yep, which is also here. The lovely little pinger. It pings your opponent for 1, but every time you cast an instant or sorcery, it untaps. So it sort of just tacks 1 additional damage onto every one of your burn spells.
And for what it's worth, Mike, I'm willing to admit it, we were wrong about Get To Lava Runner. That card is good.
Mm-hmm. Recent and still seeing some amount of play, standard all-star Gitu Lava Runner is 1 red for a 1/2, and as long as there are 2 or more instants and or sorceries in your graveyard, it gets +1/+0 and haste. So sometimes a blockable shock is still worth it.
Its strength comes when you can draw it in the late game, and it's not really a dead draw most of the time.
Yeah, just sort of being able to get in there, and no one really wants to waste removal spells on it. It's not a great juicy target. Other notables are Fire Blast. This is a classic from way back in, I want to say Visions, but I could be wrong on that.
It is Visions. You are correct.
All right, so this is a 6 mana spell, and this is a 17 land deck, and you might be saying, why on earth am I playing a 6 mana spell in a 17 land deck? Well, I'll tell you what. So Fire Blast is 6 mana to deal 4 damage to any target, and it does also just have the alternate casting cost of sacrificing 2 mountains, and it doesn't matter how many lands you're left with when the game's done. So this is just a nice way to sort of chunk in that last 4 damage. I've even seen Burn in situations where they've been able to pop off 2 of these back to back. Other sort of synergy cards are Needle Drop, which is a 1 mana instant. It deals 1 damage to target creature or player that was dealt damage this turn, and then you draw a card, which is sort of a nice way to keep the cards flowing. It's not the most efficient, but it does its job. And then just a pile of 1 mana 3 damage spells.
A bevy, ahoy polloi, panoply.
Yeah, a panoply. All right, that's certainly one way to pronounce that word.
How do you say it? I don't know.
I've always heard panoply.
All right, Mike. Whatever.
I don't know, man. All right, so when does this deck really do well, and when does it do poorly?
I think it just sort of does well in general right now. Traditionally you think of red as doing really well in metas that are a little bit unstable, where folks are still trying to figure stuff out. But I would argue that this was one of the best decks back when blue-black was legal as well. Or you know what I mean, when the blue-black decks and Gush were a big deal. So I'm not really sure if that old wisdom really applies to Pauper. And the reason I don't think that is because in Pauper, the decks can be a little dirtily. So if you have a super fast aggro deck that doesn't care about putting creatures on the battlefield, you might have an edge over a lot of the decks in the format.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the best way to put this. And also, when people are focusing more heavily on sideboards for other matchups, because it doesn't take that much life gain to offset Burn's game plan by a couple turns. But we definitely saw there was 1 week, and I think we even covered this challenge, where Burn just absolutely crushed the competition. It was 100% because a bunch of people were teching their sideboards specifically to answer the blue-black Angler Delver decks, and had, as a result, cut some of the life gain out of their sideboard as a way to sort of combat this deck. And we just saw Burn kind of like run rampant, especially because, we're seeing a deck doing really well that's playing a couple of copies of Snuff Out, which has the alt casting cost of dealing 4 to you, and that is a real cost in a Burn matchup. That's basically giving them a free Fire Blast. So I definitely think that this is one of those decks where it will always be fine. Like, I never think that Burn is just like a complete absolute trash deck, and it's also perennially very cheap online. Like, right now I'm looking at a list that is sitting at $15.77 online, and this deck will pretty much remain unchanged until the next time they print a riff on Lightning Bolt, and even then it might not be good enough. All right, next up on our list of aggro decks, we have Boggles, a deck that I personally cannot stand, but we're going to talk about anyway. Adrian, what is a Boggle?
Well, Slippery Boggle is a card from Shadowmoor that's a 1/1 with hexproof, and so any card which is a 1/1 with hexproof is referred to as a Boggle in my experience. And I think there are two. There's Gladecover Stout and Slippery Boggle.
Yeah, those are definitely the best ones we have available to us. There is also Silhana Ledgewalker, which is a 2-mana 1/1 with hexproof, and it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying.
I don't really think of that as a Boggle, but yeah, I guess it is.
It sees play in the deck, so we're going to chunk it in here. But the entire point of this deck is to resolve a hexproof creature early on in the game, pile it sky high with auras, and just turn that creature sideways over and over until your opponent is no longer at a positive life total.
And there are Boggles decks in other formats, specifically Modern. I don't think that they're... I mean, you could theoretically play this deck in Legacy. I don't think anyone does.
I've seen a Legacy Boggles deck. You get to play Unstable Mutation.
Mike, stop.
You get to play Unstable Mutation so you can pitch it to your Force of Will.
Oh.
Adrian.
I guess in some twisted world that does make sense.
Yeah, but this is a deck that has a pretty linear game plan, but still has a decent amount of play within the format. So what are we slapping on our creatures? We're slapping on stuff like Rancor. Again, we're slapping on Ethereal Armor, which is a single mana for an aura that gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each enchantment you control and first strike.
We're slapping on Armadillo Cloak.
Yep. Ancestral Mask gives you +2/+2 for each other enchantment in play. Notably counts your opponent's stuff in the mirror. We've got all sorts of options here. And the really interesting thing about this is we've started to see sort of this evolution. I believe it was after the Mythic Championship qualifier, where we started to see sort of these versions of the deck where you're playing a couple of more colors out of the sideboard, and supporting that off of the back of Crumbling Vestige, the colorless land that enters tapped, but when it enters, you get to add a mana of any color to your mana pool. And also the 4 copies of Utopia Sprawl and Abundant Growth. So, again, pretty low land count on this one, and unfortunately for the deck, relatively low creature count. There aren't really that many super efficient creatures for this deck. And
the infect problem.
Yeah, a little bit less. Like, there's more options here than for infect, but it definitely suffers a lot of the same problems and kind of also has a lot of the same benefits in that it's just trying to suit up a single creature, maybe protect it a little bit, and just go to the face over and over again. Other sort of neat cards in here. We've also got Aura Gnarlid, which is 2 and a green for a 2/2, and can't be blocked by creatures whose power is less than it, and it gets +1/+1 for each aura on the battlefield. Just sort of a secondary payoff. And then also Heliod's Pilgrim, which goes and tutors up auras, so you can get whatever the best thing is at the given moment. And spoiler alert, it's almost always Ancestral Mask or Armadillo Cloak, depending on your matchup. So what decks is this deck really good against, and when does it kind of do poorly?
It's bad against decks with a lot of edict effects because they'll just make you sacrifice the creature. But I think it's, again, like Burn, it just punishes decks that aren't really that fast.
Yeah. And it also like distinctly punishes decks that are relying on targeted removal. Like,
yeah. And I guess it doesn't do so well against fog effects.
It doesn't do great against fog effects, but like fogging this for one turn doesn't always mean you're alive on the next turn.
Right, because the creatures are very hard to deal with.
Yeah, like once they get out of range, like there's that slight window where they're sort of fragile in terms of how large they are. Like the turn 1 Boggle, if you can somehow deal with that, it's not as difficult, but it sort of snowballs very quickly. And it's very easy for them to sort of get out of reach of even non-targeted removal. But yeah, this is very much a deck that if there are not a bunch of edict effects, the target player sacrifices a creature effects, you have a much, much better time. And we sort of saw during the past, I'd say 6 months or so, this have its sort of time in the spotlight at the challenges when people felt that this was a good deck to run. It also took down that aforementioned Mythic Championship qualifier in a pretty distinctive fashion. So this is definitely a deck where if you've played Boggles, or would you recommend this for someone who's played Infect in other formats?
I mean, I think it is not Infect. There is an actual Infect deck in Pauper, but it's not very good. But yeah, I would say this is a deck that's pretty close just because you're trying to get in one suited up threat. But if you play Boggles in other formats, certainly. But I think you'll find something you like here if you played Infect as well.
Yeah, if you're big on that, put all my eggs in one basket and really hope that it's a sturdy basket. I think this will feel fine for you. What's the next deck we have on our list?
Up next, we have Aristocrats.
The good old tried and true kill my own stuff for value.
Right, and you classified this as an aggro deck, and is it mostly because of Carrion Feeder beats?
I would classify this as an aggro deck, but if you really wanted to like reclassify this, I could maybe be persuaded to see this as a bit more of a mid-range deck.
Right, that's kind of what I was thinking, just because I was thinking of more of the value-oriented aspect of the deck, but there is also just, I'm going to beat down with Carrion Feeder.
Yeah, so for folks who haven't been playing super long, which standard was that? Was that the...
That was Ravnica, because it's named after Cartel Aristocrat.
Yeah, and it was also
Ravnica.
It was also when Innistrad was in
yeah, it was
standard.
Innistrad, Return of Ravnica.
Because you still had Falconwrath Aristocrat. They just kind of had like a couple years there where they named all of these creatures that sacrifice other creatures for value something Aristocrat, but this is sort of a slightly mid-rangey, but definitely aggressive deck that heavily features Carrion Feeder. I think we've talked about this in past episodes. Probably the best Aristocrat in Pauper.
Carrion Feeder's pretty good. I mean, its downside is like not even really a downside. It can't block, but if you're beating in with it, who really cares, right?
Yeah, and the goal here is to sort of play a bunch of creatures that either leave a body when they die or have some other sort of upside when they die. But we're looking at stuff here like Blister Pod, which leaves behind an Eldrazi spawn when it dies, or excuse me, a Scion. We're looking at stuff like Brindleshote that leaves behind a 3/3 when it dies. And there's other payoffs as well here. We've got Mortician Beetle, which whenever a player sacrifices a creature, it gets a +1/+1 counter. We've got Bloodthrone Vampire, which eats stuff for temporary boons. And then you play like a minimal amount of interaction in the form of stuff like Tragic Slip and card draw in the form of things like Lead the Stampede. And you've sort of finished this all off with Unearth for a bit of recursion. And, of course, Rite of Consumption for when you just need to kill your opponent dead immediately. And this is a deck where we've sort of seen some success on and off again in the past 6 months or so. But it's definitely a fun deck.
Yeah, it's fun and it can hang in there. I think it's better than I thought it was initially, but I wouldn't say it's tier one, but I think it could take down a tournament in the hands of the right pilot. In fact, it has.
Yeah, and I do again, not to like harangue on this too much. This deck is very cheap online.
You're haranguing. No, I'm joking. It's a very valid point.
This is literally $2.50. Adrian, what can you purchase with $2.50?
A Coke.
There you go. It's about the you could not purchase anything outside of like chips at a gas station with this. But that all said, it is a really cool deck. It does have some neat interactions, like it's running Hunger the Howl pack as well, because Morbid is almost always going to be active. You get to run stuff like Butcher Ghoul, which has Undying, and combo that with Scar Scale Ritual, which puts -1/-1 counters on creatures you control. Lots of interesting like little synergies here, and just a pretty solid aggro-y, mid-rangey deck. There is also like the weird combo version, but we won't get into that one today. It is out there. It does exist. I am a huge fan of the deck. But let's move on to our last aggro deck. And this is, I guess, kind of an aggro combo hybrid. Adrian, you're the one who has played the most of this deck out of the two of us. Do you want to tell us about Affinity?
Sure. Affinity is a deck that often loses to itself in Gorilla Shamans. No. Affinity is a artifact-based aggro deck that's looking to play undercosted threats. So, for example, you have ostensibly free creatures in the form of Frogmite, which is only a 2/2, but eventually you use those to ramp up to more artifacts. You can play the Affinity for Artifact Mirror Enforcer, which can be a free 4/4. And then you're also looking to play cards like Pauper Tarmogoyf, and I'm not the one who said that first, so, Mike, it's not just a joke. Carapace Forger, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2, but if you have Metalcraft, it becomes a 4/4. The other card you play is a card called Atog, which is 1 and a red for a 1/2. Atog says sacrifice an artifact. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn.
But Adrian, that means I'm just sacrificing my board to this thing.
Right. Well, once the Atog is on the board, if your opponent cannot deal with it, if your opponent has no way of like dealing with Atog directly, like Doomblade, I just said Doomblade, a kill spell of some sort, they basically have to block it every turn, because you can basically kill them out of nowhere because of how high you can pump Atog, because your lands are artifacts, your creatures are artifacts, you have tons of artifact rocks floating around, some of them even draw you cards. So the Atog becomes a very real threat that you can also later in the game, if you build up a critical mass, sacrifice them all to Atog and then fling it at your opponent. So it has an automatic I win button if they're unable to counter it.
So I have a question for you. Do you think that with the change to the ban list, the removal of Gush, and sort of the downtick of people playing foil, the free counterspell, and I guess also the fact that Daze is no longer in the format, do you like the Atog fling plan a little bit more than you did when those things were present in the format?
Yeah, I think that, I don't think foil like killed the deck or anything, but I think it was definitely not very well positioned against the Delver list, because the Delver list had actual ways of getting rid of Atog as well, like
Snuff Out.
Thank you. I was like, oh man, we were just talking about this. So I don't think it was very well positioned there, but it doesn't seem to really be doing well still. So I'm not really sure what to make of that.
It has seen a little bit of an uptick in play recently. It's still not like doing gangbusters out there, but it's no longer kind of a dog of the format. And I think that does bring up bring us nicely into sort of when this deck does poorly. And I would say, like, at least the ATOG half of the deck doesn't do great when counterspells are in the format, or like a lot of black non-toughness related removal.
And it's sort of in the same way as Burn too. If people come prepared for it, it's just like Modern. You can beat Affinity if you decide you want to beat Affinity, but if you don't come with your Gorilla Shamans, your Artifact Destruction, you might have a bit of a harder time. And certainly, you're right. I think that counterspell specifically are the bane of this deck, because they shut off one of your easiest ways to win, which is the Fling combo.
Yeah. And like that is kind of just sitting there as a I win button. Like I've definitely played against Affinity and just had games where I was like, okay, this is all going okay, and my opponent just resolves an ATOG, and it's just like, oh no, this game is suddenly completely different. I can never pass without counterspell mana up. Oh, and now I'm just dying to an army of 4/4s. Cool.
Right. So yeah, you attack them on two different axes, and that's really what I think made the deck good. What makes the deck awful is the mana. Even at 3 color, it's just so hard sometimes to get to the mana that you need with the deck, because the land count's very low. Some of these decks run 16, 17 lands.
Well, the land count's low, and on top of that, like, you don't get any effects that help you tutor these things up.
I'm very interested to see how the London Mulligan rule affects Affinity specifically, because I think that it loses to its opening hand more often than not.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one of those decks that will benefit from the new Mulligan rule once that goes into effect, just because its good hands are really solid, and its bad hands are like some of the most miserable hands in Magic. Because I'm sure it's someone
it's very feast or famine type deck, huh?
I was gonna say I'm sure as someone who's put in reps of the deck, like, you have seen just those absolutely terrible hands where it's like, okay, cool, I have 1 land and this is my mull to 5. I guess I keep this.
Yeah, and then immediately they Ancient Grudge it or something. It's awful.
Yeah, and you did touch on this briefly. Like, I think that this is the deck that has the most powerful hate cards against it.
Yeah, that's true of artifact decks in general, I believe.
Yeah, just like Gorilla Shaman is a doozy against this deck, because for folks who aren't familiar, Gorilla Shaman is a 1 mana 1/1 that has an activated ability of XX and 1 destroy target non-creature artifact, which just means you pay 1 mana to blow up your opponent's lands.
Well, yeah, that costs X.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. It blows up a non-creature artifact with converted mana cost of X. And since lands have no converted mana cost, boy howdy does it go to town on that deck's mana base. If you're not worried about counterspells and you're not worried about a bunch of red decks running around, it's a very, very solid choice, I think, in this day and age, especially post-London Mulligan. All right, so that brings us to the end of our aggro decks, and the other super archetype we wanted to talk about is tempo decks, and we kind of have one big overarching mess of an archetype here for
Delver.
Pauper. Yeah, it's the Delver decks. So Delver's Secrets, for folks at home who are unfamiliar, though I can't imagine, I guess it doesn't see much play in Modern these days, does it?
I don't really think so, no.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you played Modern a while ago, or you've ever seen Legacy, you know what this card is, but it is a 1 mana 1/1. At the beginning of your upkeep, you get to look at the top card of your library. If it's an instant or sorcery, you can reveal it and transform the card. It turns into a 3/2 flyer. So it is almost always, in my experience, a 1 mana and on your second a 1 mana 1/1 that on your second upkeep turns into a 3/2 in the air. So how would you describe the game plan of this deck as a whole?
Stick a threat and then protect the threat until your opponent is dead.
Yep. Not exactly.
But differently from Boggles, this one
Yes.
wants to do it on the stack, not on the battlefield.
Yes. And I think it would be fair to refer to this as the premier blue deck for our format. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I would say so. Any variant, I mean, Delver's just so strong in Eternal formats. Well, in Legacy and Pauper, I should say. I don't actually think it's that good in Vintage.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that format to really comment on it. But
Me either. I just said that.
Alongside Delver, we also get sort of this package that has shifted over the years, but has always kind of been present within the deck of a handful of fairies, specifically Spellstutter Sprite, which is a 1/1 for 1 and a blue. It has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, it counters a spell with converted mana cost equal to or less than the number of fairies you control. It also runs Fairy Miscreant, which is just a 1/1 flyer for 1 that if you control another copy of it, you get to draw a card on ETB. And recently, it's been able to add some quantity of Fairy Seer, which is a 1 mana 1/1 that just scries 2 on ETB.
So blue's not quite dead yet.
Blue's not quite dead yet because it is still one of the better colors in this format.
And according to NTG Goldfish, Blue-Red Delver is still one of the top decks in the format.
Yeah. So that is the main split here. So we kind of have these two flavors of a similar deck. Do you want to sort of elaborate, obviously beyond the fact that one of them has red in it, what the difference between these two decks is?
Sure. I typically think of mono blue as being what is the word I'm looking for here? It's more focused around Ninja, I feel like, because you have some better things to return because Spire Golem is basically free. Yeah, you have Spire Golem is the big difference in the blue deck. But what you sacrifice is the access to red. So I think in the post-Gush era, the post-Gush, post-Daze era, blue-red's probably better because, having mono islands was a much better reason to be playing cards like Gush and Daze. They were easier to play, is what I'm trying to say. In fact, checking Goldfish, it doesn't look like mono blue is anywhere close to the top, actually. So yeah, you give up some of the consistency of blue in order to have access to burn.
Yeah, and that burn really helps in matchups like Stompy. Traditionally, back in the old days when this podcast actually started, Stompy was one of the few decks that sort of preyed on the mono blue Delver decks just because they didn't have a meaningful way to interact with the bevy of low drop threats.
And mono blue was dominant for a very long time. It's actually had a lot of cards banned out of it now, if you include Daze, Gush, and
Gitaxian Probe?
Well, yeah, that too. But also I was thinking of the fairy.
Oh, Cloud of Fairies.
Yes, Cloud of Fairies. Thank you.
So yeah, like the addition of red was something that cropped up after Modern Masters 2017 when Stompy was sort of having a heyday. People retooled the deck, started including Snowlands as a way to be able to run Scred, which deals damage equal to the number of snow permanents you control to target creature, as sort of this very versatile piece of removal that scales the longer the game goes on.
And interestingly, I think that the downshifting of this was already a deck, but I think the downshifting of Augur of Bolas is what really catapulted this deck to the top.
Yes, being able to have another card that sort of synergizes. Since you're playing Delver, you want this high density of instants and sorceries. So having another card that rewards you for playing all of these instants and sorceries really just made it a nice logical fit. It lines up well against a lot of the 2/2s that Stompy likes to run if they don't have anything on them. And like it feels pretty miserable to have to burn like one of the pump spells out of that deck to get through a 1/3. So it did manage to get a couple of new tools, and that coupled with the fact that the red splash allows it to run actual removal and also a handful of sideboard cards that blue doesn't have access to, meant that this deck really, really excelled when Stompy was a huge force in the format. That said, like we've seen a resurgence of the mono blue version in the post-Gush world. I think we covered one literally last week as part of our sort of breakdown of the challenge with decks running new cards in them. And this deck is always really solid. Is this the type of thing that you would recommend to a newer player, not necessarily to Pauper, but to Magic as a whole? Or do you think that this is one of those decks where you might want to hold off on it until you're a little bit more comfortable with the game as a whole?
So I hate giving blue players a bigger head, but I think it's probably better to wait because there's just so many decisions you have to make in blue.
Yeah, I would argue that these probably have some of the most complex decision trees in all of our format.
Which, if you're a new player, I think it's just a little bit harder.
It's a little overwhelming. I think like that's a good way to phrase it. Like, there's a lot of things you can do at any given moment, and there can definitely be a sort of decision paralysis that kicks in. All right, other notable things in this deck. So yeah, we have a small counter suite. It varies from build to build, but I'd say the constant is there's almost always 4 counterspell in this deck. We're running the traditional 4 preordain, 4 ponder configuration of cantrips. The mono blue version gets access to Vapor Snag and occasionally Snap as their interaction for onboard creatures, whereas the red version gets to run bolts and screds if they so choose. What are some of the other sort of notables within this super archetype, if you will?
Did we already mention the great cantrips?
We did mention them, those great cantrips. They are very, very good.
Did we mention, let's see, counterspell? Yeah. Cantrips? Yeah. Really, I think that what makes these decks so good is the inherent value in all their creatures. I think that cannot be understated. Ninja plus anything is just so strong, except Delver.
Yeah.
Delver is actually kind of weak.
And of course with so the card that you're referring to here in this case is Ninja the Deep Hours, which is 3 and a blue for a 2/2, but it has ninjutsu of 1 and a blue. So for 1 and a blue, you can return an unblocked attacking creature you control to its owner's hand, and you get to put this in the battlefield tapped and attacking. Folks who have played with Modern Horizons are aware of this ability, but definitely one of those ones that for a long time has not been something that people run into a lot. But the main thing is this 2-mana 2/2 that comes out of nowhere draws you a card whenever it deals damage to another player, whenever it deals combat damage, to another player. And it's just a really solid way to reuse like Fairy Miscreants and Augur of Bolus and Spellstutter Sprite and even Delver of Secrets. If your opponent like goes in for the block, plays a pump spell, or I guess if they block, you can't. But I have seen Delvers get ninja'd back to hand.
Yeah, it's not the best,
very rare.
But yeah, you can.
And I will also point out that one of the things that's been showing up a little bit more frequently in this deck post bannings is accumulated knowledge. This is 1 and a blue for an instant. You draw a card and then draw cards equal to the number of cards named accumulated knowledge in all graveyards. This is kind of a way to patch over the bursts of cards that Gush could represent.
Right, that's like the latest tech in the deck. A downgrade for sure, but not bad, honestly.
Yeah, still very good. Oh, and the other big thing that this deck gets to run that I don't think any other deck really gets to run is Swirling Sandstorm. So for folks, again, this is intended as a primer, there aren't many Wraths or pseudo-Wrath effects in Pauper, and Swirling Sandstorm is probably one of the better ones. So this is 3 and a red for a sorcery, and it has no text except if you have Threshold. And so that's 7 cards in the graveyard. And if you have 7 cards in the graveyard, 7 or more cards in your graveyard, it instead reads, Swirling Sandstorm deals 5 damage to each creature without flying. And this kills pretty much everything in our format.
Everything except the giant Eldrazi. But
the giant Eldrazi and Gearseeker Serpent, I think, are the only things.
5/5. If you can kill 5/5 in this format, you're golden.
Yeah, this is sort of the sweet spot, and the fact that it doesn't hit your own flyers just sort of puts it into that perfect sweet spot. I guess the only other thing is if you were to sleeve up either the blue-red variant or the blue variant today to go play in a tournament, which would your gut shot be?
The blue-red version, I think.
All right, fair enough.
I think that deck has a little bit more play against a lot of decks in the format.
All right, yeah, I think that's legit. I think the mono blue version still has its merits, but I would definitely be looking to play a little bit more on-board interaction in the form of the screds, and also recently they did reprint those Snowlands, so the deck is no longer super hideously expensive to play in paper. All right. And I think that brings us to about the end of what we're going to cover in this first episode. So next week we will be returning with more decks in different archetypes. We still got mid-range, control, and combo to get through. But hopefully this was a nice little intro for folks who are less familiar with the format and specifically the decks that sort of see play a lot. Adrian, do you have any other sort of closing thoughts for this evening?
I'm pretty excited. Running through the decks in the format, even if it's not super in depth, I think is very valuable. And maybe at the end of this series, it's been a while since we've explored a lot of these decks. Maybe we could start doing our deck techs again. So what goes around comes around.
It feels good that it's been long enough that we can sort of do this eagle eye view again. Sort of just go through all these greatest hits of the format.
Yeah. But thanks everyone for joining us today. This podcast is brought sort of our patrons, especially Uncle Vinzo Benzo. Please consider supporting us if you like the show as well. Check below this video or the description of this podcast for details on where to find us. We'd like to remind you that you're listening to this on a platform with reviews. They're always appreciated as they boost our visibility. If you've got a deck list or an idea for a topic, you can contact us either via our website or you can email us directly at colorcommentary@gmail.com. Special thanks to my LGS Pat's Games and Mike's LGS JP Comics, and of course L. You can find our theme song Quantitative and other great tracks over at soundcloud.net/ELLELLELL. Till next week, this is Adrian and Mike signing off for Color Commentary.